Good afternoon, everyone. It's going to be kind of a short one today. It's not a very long chapter. We're going to get through it all pretty quick. So, what we're talking about today is the revolution that's taking place in Russia that begins in 1917 during World War I, and the communists how they take over. We're going to discuss that, and then we're going to discuss the results of that and how the communists ruled until 1939, which is the beginning of World War II. So, interestingly enough, there's actually going to be two revolutions that take place in Russia, and they take place, um, both of them take place in 1917. One of them starts in March of 1917. It's called the February Revolution. And one starts in November of 1917. It's called the October Revolution, or sometimes Red October. And so, of course, the first question that everybody needs to ask is, why did these revolutions happen? Why did they have a revolution in 1917? There had been previous peasant revolts and things, and earlier czars had made some reforms, Alexander III, for example, but they didn't do enough. And every time it seemed like you had a czar come along that would make things a little bit easier, a little bit better for the majority of the people, then the people in power would turn around, and as soon as that czar was weak or dead, they would turn around and reverse them. So what you have is that there's a few very rich people and a whole lot of pretty darn poor people, and much of the majority peasant population, and by far the majority of people were poor peasants, lived on farms. Most of them endured pretty nasty poverty. And so this gives rise to revolutionaries. Revolutionaries are working to hatch radical plots to overthrow the government and change the system so that their lives will be better. So you've already got that going on. You've got a lot of discontent as a result of that. Then you've got World War I happening, and Russia is just doing incredibly poorly in this war. They have a series of disastrous losses, over millions of men dying and surrendering and being lost. And at the same time, the Russian economy, which was not very efficient, is stretched to the limit, just to fight the war, which causes food and fuel shortages on the home front. So their lives get even worse while they're not winning either. And so people are just more and more discontent with the leadership of Russia and with the czar's leadership. Add to that the czar, for a period, decides he's going to go lead the military, the armies, personally. So he leaves the capital. And while he's gone, his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, is not really in charge, but she's a lot more important, right? She gets a lot more influence when her husband is off at the front. Now, he's doing a terrible job leading the armies. He's really not a very good soldier, and you should have just left that to the people who were better at it than he was and shouldn't have meddled. But then you have the Tsarina, who is back in St. Petersburg, which they had just changed the name of to Petrograd, which means Peter's city. It's just more Russian and less German. Anyway, so they're living there in this big palace, and it's all fancy and everything. The Tsarevich, the heir, the only son of Nicholas II, has congenital health problems. The big one is hemophilia, and they tried and tried and tried to find some way to take care of him. And what happens is this wandering holy man by the name of Rasputin, Grigory Rasputin, seems to be able to help, for whatever reason, seems to be able to help the Tsarevich. And so he becomes very influential because he's the guy that's helping to keep alive the heir to the throne. Now, they've got, oh Lord, 5 daughters, I think, and just the one son. The Tsar and Tsarina have these 5 daughters and a son. And Rasputin, because of his ability to help with the Tsarevich, the Tsarina is very fond of him. They didn't have anything inappropriate going on or anything. Don't go there. But Um, they he definitely had a lot of influence over her, and there are rumors he was he was open to bribery and things. Not a lot of proof of any of those things, but he did have influence over her, and therefore he had influence over the government. And this guy was a nobody. Okay, as far as the people who ran Russia were concerned, this guy is just some crazy opportunist who is taking advantage of the Tsarina and all of these things. They actually assassinate him, and you should look up what happened when they tried to kill him. He was apparently very difficult to kill. I believe they shot, stabbed, strangled, poisoned, and drowned him. They might have burned him too. I don't remember. But yeah, I mean, it's like the guy wouldn't die. But he's not popular. Everybody knows he's got influence in domestic affairs, and that reduces confidence in the leadership even more. And that's a photo of Rasputin there. He doesn't look like he's exactly all there, does he? So in March of 1917, all of this sort of simmering discontent in St. Petersburg, or Petrograd, if you like, erupts into mass protests, and it's over the food rations. So basically, they're food riots. And what happens is, for the first time, Russian soldiers mutiny and side with the rioters on March 12th, 3 days after, or just a few days after the rioting started. 3 days later, because he was afraid that all of this is going to end up being the death of him and his family, the Tsar abdicates. He gives up his throne, bringing to an end 400 years of the Romanov dynasty ruling Russia. And so he abdicates 3 days later, and the existing Duma, which is the name for their elected assembly there, which, by the way, was made up of just a few wealthy people and a bunch of boyar nobles. They create what's called the provisional government. Basically, the idea was it was supposed to be sort of a temporary thing. That's why provisional. And then it would be replaced by something more formal and permanent. At the same time, the communists in Petrograd form a Soviet. A Soviet is a council. Okay, that's all it means. And so they form their own council. Now, there are Soviets springing up all over Russia and the Russian Empire, okay, in various parts. And so this council will go to the Duma and say, hey, look, we control the mobs, we control the streets, you're going to have to work with us or else. So they begin to share responsibility in a period known as the dual government. Okay, and so they're going to share rule with the provisional government, but the provisional government doesn't work well with the Soviet, and so that's going to lead to the October Revolution. The provisional government is way too old school for these the communists that are running the Petrograd Soviet, and they want more radical changes. So what kinds of things were the Bolsheviks looking for when they launched this Red October Revolution? Lenin has come to be the leader of them. We'll talk about him a little bit more specifically here in a second, but he had adapted Marx's ideas on communism to fit Russian conditions, and he called for an elite group of leadership in the Soviet to lead the revolution and to set up, as he put it, a dictatorship of the proletariat. The proletariat is just the regular people, the workers and peasants, workers meaning the industrial type workers, the people in the factories and the mines and things, and the peasants meaning basically the farmers, and the soldiers as well. Okay, a dictatorship of the proletariat. The soldiers, not the officers. At this point, officers are still basically all nobles. And so conditions have become ripe for Lenin and the Bolsheviks, these are the communists in Russia, to make their move. And so the provisional government had continued the war effort. which was very unpopular, and they launched a disastrous offensive against Germany in the summer. The army, which is in terrible shape, basically mutinies and turns around and starts going home. The peasants, because the provisional government hasn't dealt with the problem of land reform. The problem is none of the people working the land own it, and so everything that they're doing is just taken from them, which helps keep them poor. It doesn't matter how hard they work; they don't get to keep any of it. So you have the peasants mad, and they end up seizing the land. They take up arms, and by arms I mean their peasant tools, things like that, and tell the landlords, clear out or else something really bad is going to happen to you. And so that's what happens, and it all starts happening in early November of 1917. So why do they call it Red October? And why is the February Revolution in March? Well, it's because Russia still used an old style calendar, and it was about 2 weeks off the calendar that we use and that most of the rest of the Western world used by this time. And so that's why it's shifted. It's a couple of weeks off. So anything that happens towards the end of one month on the old calendar is happening at the beginning of the next month in the new calendar. Okay, so Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was actually born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov in April of 1870. In 1901, he took a new name, Lenin, because he was doing party work, and the Communist Party had been outlawed, and he didn't want what was left of his family to get in trouble. And what urged him to do that was when he was 17 years old, his older brother, who was a university student, his older brother Alexander, was arrested and tried and executed for being part of a group that had plotted to assassinate the Tsar, Alexander III. Okay, so when the government kills his brother, and now the brother was, how into the plot he was is kind of debatable. Lenin certainly didn't think he was doing anything all that vital to it. And so to Lenin, this was just a sign that the government was just utterly corrupt. And so it pushes Lenin to become more radical. Okay, and they were from a generally a middle class family. And so Lenin goes to university. He gets in a lot of trouble for his political activities. He's in and out of prison as a young man. He's even forced to leave Russia for a while, and he goes and lives in Switzerland. And then after the Tsar abdicates, he returns. So when the October Revolution begins, basically that kicks off a fairly long and incredibly bloody, ugly civil war, the Russian Civil War, which eventually, as I'm sure you know, the communists will win. So how did they do that? Because they started off a bunch of untrained nobodies. They didn't really have any weapons or training or anything. It was a bunch of peasants and workers. Okay, what they had on their side was numbers, but the Russian army was always very big too. Well, he does it a couple of ways. First of all, he very quickly, Lenin has taken over the Petrograd Soviet, so he's basically running the country right then. So he makes peace with Germany. Okay, now he also is reaching out to the mutinying army soldiers. He says, "Look, I'm going to pardon all of you. You're victims of a corrupt system, and you shouldn't be punished for refusing to fight for them. So if you'll come home and you'll fight for us, you're on the side of right and justice. And when we win, all of any crimes that you may have committed by mutinying or whatever, they'll be pardoned." And so he gets a bunch of soldiers that way. Okay, they're still not real organized. They're more like big bunches of bandits running all over the place. But he's made peace with Germany. They signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Russia pulls out officially of the war with Germany. so that they can focus all of their energy on defeating their enemies at home. Okay. The communist forces become known as the Red Army, and they fight under the Red Banner, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. But they adopt a policy which is called war communism, and in this they take over the banks, the mines, the factories, the railroads, the farms where they produce the food. They start drafting peasants to do either into the military or to do factory work because they need the factories to be staffed. And so they'll pull peasants off of their farms and put them to do that. So they're basically organizing the economy, putting it into a war footing, and they're really not giving people a lot of choice. People were getting drafted into this, and if you said no, bad things happened to you or to your family. So you pretty much did what they said. Doctors were drafted. They needed doctors. Oh, you're a doctor. Welcome to the Red Army's medical corps. Or we're a group of partisans, which is basically communist guerrilla fighters. And basically, not much better than bandits, honestly. But they would come into a village and say, "You're all going to help us," at gunpoint, take what they needed, and then leave. Well, the whites would come along, which is the pro-czarist side, the side that was in favor of returning the czar to rule, or at least the provisional government. The whites would come by the same town later and say, "Well, you helped the communists," and they'd shoot everybody. Or vice versa. Same thing happened the other way. If the whites showed up into a town and conscripted all the young men and took the food and everything, then when the Reds came 2 weeks later, they would shoot the villagers for being supporters of the whites. It was pretty ugly. It was crazy. Eventually, what happens is a fellow by the name of Leon Trotsky becomes the head of the communist forces, the Red Army and Navy technically, but they didn't really have much of a Navy. Anyway, so he turns and he begins to train them and organize them. And he's the guy that turns the Red Army into an effective fighting force. Okay. And so he helps to create one of what basically becomes, there are basically three things that help prop up the Soviet Union, the Soviet state. One of them is the Red Army. Okay, just all of the communist military forces. And so Trotsky helps to create that. The Allies will actually end up intervening to support the whites. After World War I ends, the U.S. actually sends soldiers to Russia to intervene on the side of the whites. So do the British, so do the French. And when they do that, that actually backfires because the communists then call on nationalism and patriotism and love of their country. Russians may hate their government, but they love their home. Okay, in Russia, the nickname for the homeland for Russia is Zarodina, the motherland. Okay, it is their mother. They know that it nourishes them and takes care of them, and it is their home. And so when foreigners come along, the communists do a very good job of appealing to the average Russian and saying, "Rise up and drive out these foreigners, and help us to defeat the traitors who would call on foreign help to oppress you." And it works. And so more and more people begin to side with the Reds, with the communists. And eventually they'll be the ones that win the Civil War. Okay, well, I promised you I would talk to you about their red flag. The red flag has long been an emblem of revolution in Europe. And so that's why their flag is red. It's got three symbols on it. It's got a golden hammer and sickle and a gold star. And the hammer is the symbol of the industrial workers. The sickle, which was used to cut grain, is the symbol of the peasant farmers. So these are the symbols of the people of this new Soviet nation. And the workers and peasants of the Soviet Union. And you'll hear in speeches by the Soviet leaders, they refer to that. The workers, the peace-loving workers and peasants of the Soviet Union, and so on and so on. Okay, and the star that's above them is emblematic of the Communist Party, and there, notice it's above them. That's because that's who rules. Okay, so the Communist Party becomes a one-state nation. They outlaw other political parties. Only the Communist Party is allowed, and so that's what ends up happening. And this is why their flag is what it is. And if you haven't noticed, there is a video that's on YouTube that I put a link to here with in this folder that you found this in. It's the Soviet Union's anthem with the lyrics in English. You should go listen to it. It's a powerful piece of music. It's very inspirational, and I can see how it definitely helped them to draw people to their side. Okay, so we start off with Lenin as the leader, and we're going to talk a little bit about what he did when he was leader, and then we're going to move to Stalin. Now, there was a fellow by the name of Rykov who was there in between a little bit, and there's a little bit of rivalry, well, there's a fair amount of rivalry between the various branches of the government and the various parts of the state, but what's going to happen is that Stalin, after Lenin passes, Stalin is going to collect enough power to basically take over. And so here we have three of the main leaders of the Communist Party in the early days, or the Soviet Union in the early days. To the left, you have Vladimir Lenin. Then in the center there, you've got Joseph Stalin. His name wasn't really Stalin. I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, his real name, but it doesn't much matter. He was, interestingly, he's not actually Russian. He's from Georgia, not our U.S. state, but the part of the Soviet Union that was Georgia is where he's from, down in the southern, it is in the south, part of the Soviet Union. But Stalin means of iron, so he changes his name to basically Man of Steel. And the fellow to the right is Leon Trotsky. He is the guy he's the mastermind behind creating the effective Red Army. So here's a timeline, and we have World War I beginning in 1914. Then in 1917, really things start to happen as far as the revolution is concerned. In March, the revolution forces the Tsar to abdicate. They form the provisional government. Next month, Lenin comes back. In July, they lose a huge number of people in battle against German and Austro-Hungarian forces. And then, of course, in November, the Second Revolution, the October Revolution, results in the Bolsheviks taking over the government. And then in December, they start to seek peace with Germany. In March the next year, Russia will sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ends the war officially with Germany. They give up scads of territory as part of it, including basically like Poland and a lot of that area. Anyway, in July, a civil war will begin between the Reds and the Whites. The Tsar and his family, who have been captured by the Reds and taken off to a fairly comfortable imprisonment. They were actually being kept at a dacha. Dacha is like a country estate kind of thing. It's often either someplace like a ski resort or down by a beach or something. Anyway, so they take them off to this dacha, which is sort of like I said, it's a big, it's kind of like a country palace. It's very comfortable. They've got servants and all that, but it's kind of secluded and away from everybody. Well, what happens is their guards believe that the Whites are going to try to come and break the Tsar out and free him and recreate the empire, put the Tsar back in power. And so what they do is they kill them all. They kill the Tsar and his wife and all of his children. And we'll talk a little bit about rumors of one of the daughters getting away here in just a minute. Then in August, the British, the American, the Japanese, and other foreign forces begin to intervene in Russia, which we mentioned before, and how that kind of helps the communists. By March of 1921, the communist government has won. The whites become basically bandits on the fringes of society. Those guys will last for over a decade, running around out in the backside of beyond, typically out in Siberia, well away from the big population centers. And so the communists, by March of 1921, have won their civil war and are basically in complete charge of Russia. Now, speaking of the murders of the Tsar and his family, the Tsar's youngest daughter was a little girl. Her name was Anastasia Romanova. Romanova just means daughter of the Romanov family. So she's the Grand Duchess Anastasia. And pretty much everybody thought she had been killed when the Bolsheviks murdered the Tsar and the rest of his family and dumped them down a mass grave in the bottom of a mine that had been abandoned. But rumors that she had survived begin to circulate pretty quickly. And what ends up happening is several women will come out and claim, no, I'm the escaped daughter of the Russian Tsar Anastasia, and the property of the Romanov family should be mine. Because they were a very wealthy family. And now everything that was in the Soviet Union, of course, had been seized. But they had assets other places as well. So she's trying to get hold of those. And this starts, like a year or so later. When it's just ridiculously soon. The most famous of them is a woman named Anna Anderson, and that's her on the right. The little girl on the left, that's the actual Grand Duchess. That's what she looked like as a child. And Anna Anderson actually ends up going to court and struggles for years, decades. I think she filed the suit in like 1928, 1930, something like that. And this lawsuit drags on and on and on for like 40 years. It's like the 70s before they finally just dismiss it. She's trying to prove that she's Anastasia, and she never really proves her case. They dismiss it finally. After she dies, she's actually cremated, but there are remains left. She had left locks of hair and this, that, and the other. They had found by this point the Tsar, the Tsar's family's bodies, and had exhumed them and properly interred them somewhere. And what they'll do is they do a DNA test. And DNA evidence after her death in 1991 proved that she was lying. So we know that she was not actually Anastasia. The fact is, Anastasia died with her family. It's just sort of a romantic thing that she didn't. There's even it's not a Disney, but there's a cartoon about it even. So who knows? It's just one of those weird little stories. So Lenin and his buddies, the Bolshevik communists, have taken over. And now that the war is over, now that they have got control, they begin to reorganize everything. And they're going to produce a new constitution that sets up an elected legislature, which will eventually be called the Supreme Soviet. And a Soviet, like I said earlier, it's basically just a council. It's the governing body of an organization. And what happens is they create Soviets at every level, these councils at every level. Each block in a city has a Soviet. Each factory has a Soviet. Each farm village has a Soviet. And each of those picks one of their members, or one or two of their members, to go and be at the city level. So like if you were in a block in Petrograd, okay, which they changed the name of to Leningrad after Lenin dies. So say you were a member of the Soviet and you're picked from your neighbors in the block as a good Communist Party member who will serve on the Soviet, and so you join the block Soviet, and then you get pushed up to the city Soviet or the neighborhood Soviet or something, and then to the city Soviet they go up, and then from the city they go to the Republic Soviet, because essentially the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, is technically, it's kind of like the United States in that it's a bunch of independent, supposedly, republics who have all united together to work together. In reality, it's an empire ruled from Moscow. But just going on with this, so you would be at the say the Ukrainian, say you were from Kiev instead of Petrograd. Kiev's a better example because Kiev is in Ukraine. Kiev is the capital of Ukraine. So you on the Ukrainian SSR's Soviet. Well, then from that they take people and they push them up from the Ukraine to the Supreme Soviet, and so you would represent the Ukraine at the Supreme Soviet. So it's just sort of levels of councils pushing upward. Okay. And so they gave all the citizens over 18 the right to vote, male or female. If you're over 18, boom, you can vote. They police all political power, all the resources, and all the means of production in the hands of the workers and peasants, which really means the government. Okay. They adopt what's called the New Economic Policy, or the NEP. Now, it does allow some capitalist ventures. Places like if you have a shoe store, you can still sell shoes. Okay, you own your shoe shop. You charge what you want. They do put price limits on things, but so there's regulation of it. But you can charge what you want. The big trick is that there's only one place that you're allowed to get shoes from, because there's only one factory in the whole country. Well, there's more than one factory, but there's only, all the factories are doing the same thing. Okay. So the state's keeping control of the banks, foreign trade, and big industries. So small businesses could reopen and profit privately, but the means of production stays in the hands of the government. And the new government unites most of the old Russian Empire into what they call the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. All right, so what we have here is a map of the early Soviet Union, and you can see where they've got it divided up into the various Soviet Socialist Republics, SSRs. And so the whole country is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That's why they call it the USSR, not Russia. But the fact of the matter is, basically, Russians run the show, because you can see how huge the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic is compared to the other SSRs. And most of the people lived in the Russian SSR. Most of the leadership came from Russia. Down here you can see the Georgian SSR to the south, just off the Caspian Sea, which is where Stalin was from. So he's not from up here. This is Leningrad, which was St. Petersburg, and then Petrograd, and then Leningrad up here to the north next to Estonia. In 1919, the areas shaded in yellow were controlled by the Bolsheviks. By 1921, all of that pink is basically controlled by the Soviets, at least officially. And that's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics on the eve of World War II. So Lenin will die in 1924, and there's something of a struggle for who's going to really take over running the country. Leon Trotsky wants to, a fellow by the name of Rykov wants to, a fellow by the name of Molotov wants to, and all of these people have important positions in the government. Trotsky was in charge of the military, for example. Molotov had been in charge of the foreign ministry, and so on and so on. Stalin at the time was the general secretary of the Communist Party, and that basically meant that he was the guy who decided who was and who was not a member of the party. And he could throw you out of the party if he wanted to. If you weren't in the party, you could not be in power. And so anybody who sort of was resistant to his control, he literally just threw out of the party. He expelled them from the party, which threw them out of office. And so he brings control into his own hands. The problem is that Stalin is a nut. He's crazy. And so when you crossed him, your life became endangered. And Leon Trotsky, for example, he's going to be cast out of government. He's going to be cast out of the party. He actually flees the Soviet Union which he helped to create. I mean, was instrumental in its creation. And he runs for his life, and he ends up in Mexico City, uh, where he is later assassinated by Soviet assassins in broad daylight. A Soviet assassin will walk up behind him and bury a pick in the back of the dude's head, and just kill him right there on the street, and then just walk off. Anyway, so yeah, Stalin brings all the economic activity under government control. So much for the new economic plan. He creates a command economy where government officials make every basic economic decision. He starts to work towards making the Soviet Union a modern industrial power. The Russians had always been trailing behind, and we've talked about that before. But he wants to make the Soviet Union a modern industrial power. And so he puts into place what he calls these 5-year plans. And the idea is to build up that industry, improve the infrastructure so that they can get goods from one place to another more easily and more efficiently, and all of these things, and increase farm output. Okay, none of those are a bad idea. The problem is when he puts it under government control, then it takes away a lot of the incentive for the people to work harder. He basically says, you're working, you don't own this farm that you're working anymore. The government owns it. It is collectively owned. It's called collectivization. Okay. And so these he takes away, he's basically undoing sort of that land reform that all of the peasants had wanted. And so he brings agriculture under government control, forces the peasants to give up their land, and then so puts them together in these collectives or living on a state-owned farm. And once they do that, he basically says, okay, here's how it works. You're going to grow 100 bushels of wheat. If you grow 90 bushels of wheat, you're going to be punished. If you grow 100 bushels of wheat, we're going to take 95 of those bushels, and you will be left with 5 bushels. That's what you get. That basically saying this is how you're going to be paid. This is the fruit of your labor is going to be this, the value of these 5 bushels. If you grow 110 bushels, you get 5 bushels, and the state will get 105, and you'll get a hearty congratulations. Okay. There's no incentive for these farmers to work any harder than they absolutely must. And as more and more people go to work in the factories, because that's what he's trying to do, is get people working in industries, and he does it very quickly. He just forces them to go. As more and more of them do that, it becomes harder for the remaining peasants to feed those people, to keep them fed, especially when you start throwing in corruption and wastage and all of that. And so what happens is he keeps raising how much the state is going to take and reducing how much the people get to keep. And in the Ukraine, which used to be the breadbasket of Russia, I mean, they fed everybody, right? I mean, it's kind of like Kansas, but much bigger. Okay. They start starving to death. Millions will starve to death. And it's just, and Stalin just doesn't care, because he wants these factory workers fed, because that's what he's focused on. Okay. When World War II comes around, Ukrainians, lots of Ukrainians helped the Nazis because they hated Stalin and the Russians, because they had starved for a decade. So the result of these 5-year plans, which were pretty unrealistic, is that standards of living don't improve. Wages were low. People didn't make much money. They had very little disposable income. Consumer goods were scarce. They didn't have enough capacity to make consumer goods. All they were building was the stuff that they needed to build stuff. Okay, it's called capital goods. But it's not like uh, things for people to use, like clothing. I mean, they got out enough clothing to keep people barely clothed, uh, but they were focused a lot more on building things to help build other factories and stuff, for example. So, like I said, Stalin is a paranoid schizophrenic. He believes everyone is out to get him, and so believing that, he makes it to where everybody wants to get him because they're terrified of him. He harbors obsessive fears that his rivals are plotting against him, planning to murder him and assassinate him and things. And so, in 1934, he launches what's known as the Great Purge, and it's going to go on for 4 years. And people are denouncing each other, family members are denouncing each other, neighbors, and there's. I heard him say that he wished Great Stalin was dead, and they would arrest you and kill you. At least 4 million people died, were purged during this era. Okay, uh, but they served Stalin's needs at first because he got rid of his rivals, and everybody else was too scared of him to resist anything he wanted. Now, that's a double-edged sword, though, because if all they do is tell him, oh, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, what happens is they start lying to you to protect themselves. So if you ask, okay, Bob, so are we producing enough gasoline for our army? Oh, yes, sir, we have plenty of gasoline. Our factories, our refineries are putting out more than enough for our needs. As a matter of fact, we have a surplus that we could maybe sell off to raise some badly needed money. And so Stalin would go and sell some of their gas when they didn't even have enough gas for what they needed. But because they lied to him, so now not only are they short, but now they're very short. You see what's happening? So people would cover their butts. Or if a factory had a quota of medicine, certain number of vials of, let's say, insulin, because it's a nice clear liquid, looks a lot like water. If they were supposed to put out so much insulin every month and they couldn't do it for whatever reason, they just started filling vials with water, or half water, half insulin, to make up the numbers. And they'd ship it out. And they'd be like, yes, we have produced 10,000 vials of insulin this week. Sure, it's really 5,000 vials worth of insulin and 5,000 vials worth of water, but once it's out the door, it's not their fault anymore. Okay. One of the big groups that was hit really hard was the military leadership by these purges. He never trusted them because he felt that they were still loyal to Trotsky, who had created the military. And so he ends up killing off most of the higher level, especially leaders, and begins replacing them with people who are more politically reliable, but maybe not as militarily skilled. And that's really going to come back to haunt them in 1941 when Germany invades the Soviet Union, and he's got a bunch of people who really maybe don't know what they're doing in charge of his army. So during this time, you have the Soviets pursuing two very different goals simultaneously in foreign policy. As communists, both Lenin and later Stalin, are looking forward to the time when the Soviets won't be really the only communist country in the world, when international communism will have swept the world, which Marx says is an inevitable conclusion, that the revolution will take place worldwide and everyone will eventually become communist, and then we will have a utopia, the universe will be happy, etc., etc. And so to help with that, Lenin will form the Communist International, which is better known as Comintern, which is an organization that is going to aid revolutionary groups around the world. Okay, so if there is a Communist Party of America, for example, they're going to help them out when the communists in Spain are fighting against the nationalists in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. The Soviet Union helps them out, and so on and so on. Okay. Now, as Russians, however, they want to guarantee their own security by winning the support of other countries. And here's the problem. If one part of your country, one organization that your country sponsors is advocating the overthrow of other governments, it's hard to get along with everybody else. And yet they're still trying to do that. Okay. One of the things that they do, for example, is they try to join the League of Nations as a member nation. They try to get non-aggression pacts signed with other countries like Germany, which they'll do, and so on and so on. So that's what they're going for. So on the one hand, they're making everybody very, very nervous with their anti-capitalist, anti-Western propaganda that they're spreading and their support of armed revolutionary groups in other countries. And yet at the same time, they're saying, oh, we're harmless. We want to live in peace and friendliness with all of our fellow nations of the world and part of the League of Nations and participate in all of that. So it's a very almost two-faced kind of foreign policy. And it leads to a lot of people finding it very difficult to trust the Soviets. And that includes, by the way, most Americans. Now, beginning under Lenin and really solidifying under Stalin, what we've done is we've seen Stalin basically really create a totalitarian state in the Soviet Union. And let's discuss for a few minutes what life was like in that. So a totalitarian state is a form of government where you have a one-party dictatorship, and it attempts to regulate every aspect of the lives of its citizens. The Soviet Union is not, obviously, the only totalitarian state, certainly not the only one even in the 20th century. All you have to do is look a little bit to the west of the Soviet Union, and you'll see Germany, which becomes, in the 1930s, a totalitarian state under the Nazi Party. A little bit further south from Germany, you see Italy becoming a totalitarian state under the fascists. Spain becomes a totalitarian state under the nationalists. Japan becomes a totalitarian state, and so on and so on. There's a lot of them. Okay, and what they do is they want to totally regulate you. That's why it's called totalitarian. They want to be in charge of every aspect of your lives. And to ensure obedience, they all pretty much do the same kinds of things. Stalin, he uses secret police. Eventually, the group that will become the KGB, it's their most famous version. They've had other names before that, the NKVD and the Oprachniki, and anyway, Obrezheniy. But it's the secret police. These are the people that spy on your own people. Massive censorship. The only legal newspapers, for example, were the ones that were produced by the state. Interestingly enough, the official newspaper of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union was called Pravda, which is Russian for truth, even though there wasn't a whole lot of it in there. They use violent purges. We've talked about that. And terror. People were terrified to cross Stalin or any part of the government because that's how they ruled. They bombard the public with relentless propaganda. They indoctrinate the youth. They basically brainwash kids into believing the party line. And they replace religion with their own ideology. That's not entirely the way it works over in Germany and so on. But we'll discuss that a little bit more later on. But they want to replace religion with their own ideology. They don't want you to have any faith in anything except the state. The state is everything. Joseph Stalin himself was an atheist. Here's a quote by him: "If God existed, he'd have made the world more just." So that gives a pretty good idea of how he feels about the issue. Marx would call religion the opiate of the masses. It exists only to keep people docile. So communists not real big on religion. That's why a lot of times they get called godless commies. All of this regulation, all of this control is going to change how the Russians live. It creates a new society. It doesn't make a lot of difference, though, because basically the only difference is instead of being of noble birth, making you the people in charge and running the show, now the thing that makes you able to get involved and run the show is party membership. And they controlled party membership very carefully. Not everybody could join the Communist Party. And so they create a society where a few elite groups emerge as a new ruling class. That's not the big change is who's in charge, not how they rule. They do, however, provide free education, free medical care, daycare for kids, inexpensive housing, public recreational facilities, things like that. So in some ways, that's an improvement. It was especially better for factory workers, not so much the peasants. But they do provide those things. They make jobs available based on a little bit more available based on merit and testing that rather than birth and connections. Although connections still a major part of it, and you can, especially not having a bad connection. You don't want the wrong people to think badly of you, because if they do, you're never going to get anywhere. Another thing that happens is that women are granted equality under the law. Okay? Under the old Russian system, women and men, different rules and laws applied to them. Women were definitely subordinated to men. And now, under the law, at least in Soviet society, women are granted an equal part. But again, you've got censorship. They control the arts. They control films that are made and produced and put out. They control what kind of clothes you can wear. They control all of these things. Okay. Here you have another great quote from Joseph Stalin. Ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns, so why should we let them have ideas? That's that censorship, the control of thought itself. And speaking of state control in the arts, Stalin and his government forced artists and writers to conform to a new style called socialist realism. And its goal is to boost socialism, which is essentially communism, let me rephrase it. Communism is a kind of socialism under totalitarian control, basically. But the goal of arts under the Soviet system is to show Soviet life in a positive light. And you can see kind of in the background here an example of what that sort of thing would look like in a painting. And you have the Red Army leading a parade of people in their sort of native costumes from the various SSRs, and you have the flags of the various regions. And at the front, they're carrying a banner with the picture of the glorious leader Joseph Stalin, who is, helping them out. The government controlled what books were published, what music was heard, which works of art were displayed. If you tried to publish something that the government did not approve of, you were arrested and thrown in prison, sent off to the gulags. Composers like Shostakovich and Prokofiev will emerge from this, and they have to sort of follow the party line, and yet they're still able to create some pretty majestic music. And but boy, if you stepped out of line, it was off to the gulags for you. And you should know what a gulag is. That's a pretty Gulag. Just a hint, you may want to know what a gulag is. And that was the ever-present threat of stepping out of line, which artists, are known to do. And that's going to do it for today. We've got the Russians all revolted. And we're going to move on now towards our next chapter, which is going to cover problems in the West, in Western Europe, and challenges to democracy there, which is going to lead us into the last part we're going to cover, which is World War II. So for now, I'll sign off. Have a good day.